We've been holding our programs here since May of 2008, and typically our programs have been on subjects that would be generally described as biomedical science or computer science or information technology, but not for the most part in the social sciences. And tonight we'll have a bit of a departure from our past history, recognizing that social scientists are scientists too. Conducting research. That may be a surprise to some people, but that's not to all of us. For tonight's program, I want to, before we start tonight's program, I want to just get a quick sense of who is here. How many of you are here for the first time to one of our programs? Okay, so this is consistent with our thought that all of those other kinds of scientist types decided not to come to social science. And we want to encourage all of you to show them, to model for them the importance of hearing everything. So come to our future programs on other areas of science. And how many of you had the chance to hear the program on these days this month? Yes. That's pretty good. Actually, a lot of people who showed up for the first time heard that program today. So you did a good job. So anyway, so for tonight's program, I'm just going to briefly note that we would appreciate very much at the end of the program, there's a yellow page that you can leave us any comments, or we would like you to sign up for our mailing list so we can bring you into our programs. But we're trying to make sure we are responsive to what is of interest to you and make this a forum that's useful. We also want to try and have thoughtful discussions, so please try and be open-minded, not completely open-minded, but open-minded enough to hear what other people have to say and participate in the discussion. I'm going to hand things over tonight to Stuart Henry, who is also a co-director for the Ethics Center, and somebody whose academic interest is specifically in crime, not to mean that he commits crimes, although that may be the case. You can ask him about that, but is interested in why crime occurs and how one might best deal with crime. So Stuart will moderate the program, and he will take it from there. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. Well, it's good to see you all here. We're going to, as Mike said, look tonight at the questions surrounding the ethics of doing what is called ethnographic or participant observation research with populations that are engaged in illegal activities. And so first question, you can do all kinds of research methods to study crime. A lot of those methods are unobtrusive, don't get you involved or close to criminals. They get you close to computers and statistics and data. But there is a subset of researchers in sociology and anthropology who engage in work that looks directly at the activities and practices of folks who are engaged in deviant behavior through to criminal behavior. And maybe the first question that you want to ask is, well, why do you need to study criminals face-to-face in order to study crime? Isn't it enough to study the victims? Is it enough to study the harms produced? Isn't it enough to study the law? And the argument from those of us that take this research method seriously as a valuable contribution to the social science research literature is that there is a whole lot of information, understanding that you can obtain from directly engaging with the participants in research practices that's not available at a distance, that's not available through objective data, it's not available from analyzing the law or others engaged in crime. You can only get that data by actually looking at and seeing first face-to-face what offenders do, more importantly, what they think, and more importantly, what the activities that they engage in that harm others mean to them. And we're talking here about crime and a whole range of crime, from, as I said, deviance that's not necessarily criminal, to criminal activities of robbers, burglars, and other kinds of offenders. So the very fact that it provides this kind of information, it provides you with an understanding that would give you insight to the way people think when they're engaged in criminal activities. Most of us can't easily understand how, and many of us make the assumption how that is people could engage in crime and law violation. And others of us will say, Well, if they do it, they must be doing it for the money, they must be doing it for some perverse pleasure. But when you look at why offenders engage in crime, you'll find, if you do it in this particular, using this particular method, a whole range of other reasons come out that aren't necessarily those simple assumptions. The problem is, if you're a public policy maker and you're formulating policy to make a difference in crime harm reduction, you need policies that address the causes and the reasons why people are engaged in the law violation. And if they're not doing it for rational choice reasons, that is because they're making money out of it, and your policy is all about increasing the costs to them of engaging in the activity, it's not going to make any difference. So there's a public policy reason about why you need to know how they actually think. And there's a series of issues around methods about when you do that, what are the moral implications for you of engaging in that kind of activity? How much information can you know about an offense that's going on before you have to say, I've got to report this, people are going to get harmed if you carry on? And can you, as legitimately as a researcher, can you legitimately then say, no, my role in this is to be an objective, neutral researcher, and I should not be interfering with this action scene because I will disturb what's going on. If you do interfere and you report it, are you no more than a spy? Are you doing research? Where's the scientific objectivity in that? So that's one question. Another is, how far can you actually engage in practices of this kind of research when ethically and morally you may be opposed to the content of what you're reviewing, and how might bias the results of what you're reporting? So these become serious moral and ethical questions faced by a researcher. And tonight we're going to explore some of those and the problems that it presents to doing this kind of research. To do that, we are fortunate to have a sociologist from the University of Detroit, University of San Diego. I used to be in Detroit, and was a University of Detroit. The University of San Diego, Erik Fritsvold, who is got his doctorate at the University of California, Irvine, and is particularly skilled in the kinds of methods that involve distant observation research that we're talking about, and has used those to great effect in doing the study that is reported in his book, Dorm Room Drug Dealers, which, if you haven't worked it out, is about college students who engage in buying and selling drugs on university campuses, which is a crime. And so the question he's going to raise is, do you have to be a criminal to study crime? Do you then have to be involved to the extent that you could be seen as also breaking laws? Erik.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A grand thank you to the Fleet Science Center for having me. A grand thank you to Drs. Henry and Clemens for doing the legwork to put this thing together. We're going to be spending the next 15-20 minutes looking at some of the core research methodological issues and findings from a 6-year ethnographic investigation into affluent drug dealers. And to frame that conversation a little bit, in criminology, we have a very real and tangible challenge. And that challenge is that, by definition, we study inherently secretive groups. Turns out most people doing crime ain't trying to get caught for doing crime. So historically, when you look at criminology as a discipline, we have disproportionately focused on captive populations. We've disproportionately focused on people who've been caught for crime. They're easy to identify. They're in our jails, state and federal prisons. And so when we have these theories about motivations and when we try to inform public policy, we're disproportionately talking about policies applicable to people who have been caught for a crime. So dealing with inherently secretive groups, we have this problem that raises a host of ethical concerns that apparently we'll be talking about tonight. This is a 6-year insider's account of 50 affluent drug dealers who frankly bungled their way through the illegal drug trade for, again, the better part of 6 years. And despite their collective bungling, we had one subject spend one afternoon in police custody. And with that exception, nobody got to see the inside of a jail cell, let alone a state or federal prison cell, even though their crimes warranted that kind of punishment. So real briefly, the next 15 minutes, we'll talk about the methodology, core findings of the research, and then I really look forward to having a back and forth discussion about the ethical implications. And for the record, none of which I believe I handled perfectly, let alone well. So I look forward to having this exchange and having it be a teachable moment, maybe, as they say. How's the audio? Good, all right. Thank you much. So let's talk about research methods real quick. I was fairly lucky to be in a position as a graduate student studying criminology for the first time, engaging in my first piece of original research, to have a friend. And these are how these stories start. I had a longtime friend who, since we parted ways, had evolved into a relatively significant life of crime. So as a graduate student studying criminology, I proposed to my advisor a handful of possible topics, one of which involved reestablishing this relationship to interview him and maybe a few of his friends who were evolving to be moderate, if not significant, drug dealers. So through that initial point of access, myself and my friend and co-author Rafiq Muhammad, who now teaches in Georgia, or presumably would be here tonight, eventually gained access to almost 50 affluent drug dealers. Midway through the project, apparently word got out that we were studying drug dealers, and we had people come up to us and say, hey, maybe you should talk to me. So this eventually snowballed into about 50 subjects. And roughly half those subjects, 26 of the 50, dealt in traditional illicit street drugs, disproportionately marijuana, but also significant amounts of cocaine and ecstasy as well. The other 25 subjects or so, and we literally stumbled upon this population, dealt almost exclusively in prescription drugs. So they were trading prescription drugs, they were selling prescription drugs typically at $1 a pill, not really to make money, but more to facilitate their access to apparently the variety of prescription drugs that they desired, Adderall being the king. These subjects, at the time of the study, all between 18 and 24, all current or former college students, and they spanned a cluster of universities in Southern California. They were overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male, and overwhelmingly business majors, current or former, which I think raises another artery of research in all seriousness. And looking beyond their clothes and their vehicles, it became pretty clear that they were from a high socioeconomic background, that they were affluent. Of our 50 dealers, we had parents who were international and domestic business people. We had parents who owned multiple car dealerships. We had parents who were medical doctors, psychiatrists, accountants, accountant executives. And I don't know, we'd have to ask the statistician what's the probability on this. Of our 50 dealers, we had 2 parents who were current or former mayors in other states. So the most obvious question that this raises is about bad decision making. Don't these people have so little to gain relatively by dealing drugs and so much to lose relatively by dealing drugs that they're seemingly making an irrational choice? So if Stuart is right about our typical models in criminology about ratcheting up punishment, these people seem to enter the scene making an irrational choice. So why hear it from me? I think the beauty of writing this kind of book is to let the dealers themselves tell their story. So I would like to emphasize that the people you're hearing from right now are absolutely not the subjects in the book. They are kind members of the audience who are playing the role of a former drug dealer for no more than 30 seconds. So again, they're not the actual subjects of the book. The person who you're going to hear from momentarily, their moniker was Stopper. At the time of her interview, one of the few female dealers in our sample, she's white from a politically conservative family in Colorado, and had the following to say about her 1-year experience as a college drug dealer. Stopper, are you in the room?
Yes. Where I'm from, stoners were kids who wore hemp. We have a kind of granola culture. But these kids, you weren't looking at the 4.0 students, but they were normal. They were involved, good majors, business majors. They didn't fit the stereotype of what a drug user would look like. These kids were pretty upstanding kids to most people. They just smoked a lot of weed.
Thank you, Scott. When recent public opinion polls suggest that the American public, when you ask them to envision a drug dealer, upwards of 95% envision a young African American or Hispanic male. And that clearly flies in the face of the criminological evidence about drug crime being relatively ubiquitous and clearly is contradicted by our small sample of 50 here. We entered the scene thinking that this was going to be a story about relatively low-level college partying. A little bit of drug use and sales at a pretty small level. And for the most part, that was true. But we were genuinely surprised at the scope and significance of the criminality engaged in by these affluent college students. Roughly a third of our subjects were the quintessential user dealers, selling enough drugs to facilitate their own drug habit, often unsuccessfully. The middle third of our drug dealers started to make significant profits and were selling somewhere in the neighborhood of $2,000 to $4,000 of drugs per week. At the upper third of our dealers, Bryce, our primary informant, and someone who earned the moniker Diamond by being the largest dealer in our sample, was selling, and we were astonished to find this, frankly, were selling somewhere in the neighborhood of $10,000 to $40,000 of marijuana per week, or roughly $150,000 per month. So as a graduate student living on a teaching assistant salary at that time, that was striking and still is striking today, employed in academia, frankly. So $150,000 of marijuana per month. So this became a story about significant criminality, which we frankly didn't expect to find. One of our most notable subjects, whose moniker was Lacoste, we wrote in the book, he's a former business major, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, preppy gangster-dressed freshman from the Midwest, who by his own declaration was quote-unquote untouchably wealthy. He sold a considerable amount of marijuana, cocaine, and ecstasy out of his vehicle and dorm room, would often deliver drugs with a lit blunt, cigar that's been hollowed out with marijuana in it, in his mouth or behind his ear, and would regularly drive around like that in a $50,000 SUV furnished by his parents. He was one of the most brash individuals that we had the pleasure of interviewing. Mr. Lacoste, what did you typically spend your profits on?
Whatever I want. I used to go on shopping sprees first semester, a whole bunch, like whatever I want. I want to buy these rims for my car that are tight, the ones that spin. Yeah, those are sick. I just buy stuff. I spend lots of money.
Thank you very much, a nice interpretation. So one of the most shocking findings, especially in contrast to the criminological literature on other types of drug dealing organizations, was the complete and total disregard for law enforcement. A lack of even the most fundamental risk minimization strategies employed in this group, and that was absolutely shocking. For example, we had drug dealers keeping drugs in dirty laundry bins and styrofoam coolers. They would deliver drugs to a car waiting on the street by putting it in their t-shirt and rolling the t-shirt over it, and then walking out to the car and putting it in the window. We had a subject who told us that he forgot roughly $1,200 of drugs in a 3-hour night class, and that he had concealed it by wrapping them in a sweatshirt, returned later to only find the sweatshirt. We had, again, the biggest dealer in our sample, Diamond. I was approaching an interview with him, and I had parked and was walking towards his apartment, and I was standing across, waiting to jaywalk, right? Apparently I am a criminal. The title, "Do you have to be a criminal to study crime?" I just now realized that means the criminal is me. Right, that's a suggestion? Okay, I should have thought of that earlier. So approaching this interview session, there's 2 lanes of traffic, a median, and 2 other lanes of traffic. So across 4 lanes of traffic, I can look through the front window of his apartment and see drugs, drug use, drug paraphernalia, money, and multiple people. The biggest dealer in our sample across 4 lanes of traffic in a relatively busy street. Clearly not concerned about protecting himself from anyone. In our 6 years in the scene, we saw 1 vacuum sealing machine, which according to criminological literature is a standard as a drug dealer. They're legal to own, legal to buy. They're the things you and I use to seal fresh fish in the freezer for some time. And apparently people store illegal drugs in them to help reduce their size and seal out the smell. Again, legal to own, relatively inexpensive. We saw 1 in our 6 years. And maybe most notably, as evidence for the lack of risk minimization, I've been reading a book by Terry Williams about a cocaine ring in New York City that employed a lot of juveniles. So you get these ex-cons who employ juveniles to hold the guns, drugs, and money because they're facing lower consequences. And these juveniles, 12, 13, 14, and 15-year-olds, product of an underperforming public school, had a sophisticated and depth-oriented knowledge of the Fourth Amendment and police procedure. These 13-year-olds knew about probable cause, what they had to do to protect themselves and their employers, right? They should be teaching constitutional law classes at my current campus. In contrast, these affluent drug dealers in college had no knowledge of police procedure, no knowledge of the Fourth Amendment, didn't ask about it, didn't investigate it, were not very concerned about law enforcement. So we asked someone whose moniker is Cecilia, who eventually became the largest female dealer in our sample, about risk minimization. Cecilia.
Well, obviously no one was very careful. Hardly anyone talked in code. There wasn't a whole lot of emphasis placed on being careful in any way whatsoever. It was very sort of, I don't know, I got the impression in college that you were protected by being in college to some extent. That obviously the authorities should be spending their time busting people that are not working toward a potentially better future. So I guess I always felt that there was a safety umbrella over most of college.
Thanks very much. So at the time of the study, we're making roughly 800,000 plus marijuana arrests per year nationwide. About 80% of those are for possession. At the time of the study, we're roughly 3.5 decades into the war on drugs, where we're locking up roughly 575,000 people in jail, state, and federal prisons where their primary crime was a drug crime. So the backdrop is this very expensive and punitive system where America uses the criminal justice system to manage drugs, seem to really be contradicted by these bungling, affluent, quote-unquote, untouchably wealthy drug dealers who, by their own declaration, didn't have much to worry about. We asked Bryce, the primary informant in the study, and his then girlfriend, now wife, Ann, why they thought they weren't subject to law enforcement scrutiny that maybe different populations are.
Probably has to do with what else you're doing and what you've done prior.
Totally. Probably the cops' just general opinion on you when it happens. I mean, if you're a clean-cut suburban kid. Oh, it's the beach also.
I think in those beach environments,
It's all college kids.
I understand there's a lot bigger world out there because I see it. It's not a priority in certain areas.
I mean, if it was that big of a priority.
People would have to change their habits.
Thank you very much, and congrats on your future marriage. So what's the core finding of the research? Bungling drug dealers of some significance, I mean, this isn't the biggest drug network the criminological literature has ever seen, but of significance, bungling their way through the drug trade, not getting caught. That was the core finding of my master's thesis, core finding of the article that my colleague and friend and I wrote after. So what happens? Bryce gets arrested. We had largely exited the scene, and it was really his arrest that drew us back into the discussion. Apparently, Bryce had been renting a 2-bedroom home for the exclusive purpose of growing marijuana. Nobody lived there. It was furnished minimally at best, as he told it, and he would only come and go in the evening. So eventually the neighbors got suspicious, as it's commonsensical that they might, and they called the police. And it turns out, so Bryce came home one day to the DEA and local police and was eventually looking at 5-year mandatory minimum sentence for cultivating over 100 marijuana plants. He had between $30,000 and $50,000 of marijuana growing equipment, 100 to 150 plants, and a bunch of money. He was looking at an additional 16 months for intent to distribute. So he was looking at roughly 6.5 years in prison as a result of this drug deal. And this was really a turning point for the research. As his trial moved forward, he came clean with his parents, who spent, as he told it, roughly $100,000 on his legal defense. He got a name brand, high-end defense attorney who had a team of investigators working for him. And as his case proceeded forward, and maybe the turning point of the whole research, in April 2000, here's the unedited email that he sent to me that details the results of his case.
just signed a deal yesterday. Basically, they dropped the big charge. And the other will not be on my record within 18 months. I have to do 100 hours of community service, lose my Fourth Amendment, get drug tested, and have to remain in therapy for at least 6 months. However, once it's all over, I can answer that I've never been arrested and nothing will ever be on my record. Even now, it's not recorded anywhere since they never made a judgment against me. Kind of like the diversion program, but better, because I have no parole or probation counselor. I am free to leave the state anytime I want. I just cannot get any misdemeanor offenses, otherwise I break the terms of the deal.
Thank you again, unedited email. So he saw a therapist, and not only did he have to test negative, as he tells it, I couldn't verify this, but according to him, he had to test negative for illegal street drugs and had to test positive for the mood stabilizing drugs that his therapist was prescribing him, because his argument was, I'm so stressed out as a young real estate professional and recent college graduate that I use massive amounts of drugs, and thus was prescribed some mood stabilizing prescription drugs by the therapist that he paid for out of pocket, along with the prescription drugs, along with court appearance costs and other costs, and the $100K for his attorney. So we follow his case. He abided by all the conditions, and my favorite line is kind of like the diversion program, but better. And in November of 2005, again, an unedited email from Bryce.
My follow-up court date was this morning at 8:30. Everything has been dismissed. No longer on any probation, and everything is expunged from my record. Anyway, today is a very good day.
So again, if he's arrested now for any crime, he has now 2 DUI offenses, but with those exceptions, would be a first-time drug offender. So where are they now? Largely for the book project, roughly after we exited the scene, 6 years in, we did our best to track down what dealers we could and ask them about them and their friends and what they were up to. And nobody is a drug dealer of significant scope. Of our subjects, we have business professionals, we have real estate professionals, we have people with advanced degrees in the social sciences, we have several law school graduates, one of whom now works at a signature law firm in another state. We have, most interestingly, one of our larger dealers whose moniker was the Monopoly, now is a high-end wine salesman, so we joke that he had on-the-job training while he was a college student selling drugs. The one exception here is Lacoste, who was academically disqualified from school, returned home to the Midwest, and rumor has it that he's facing felony charges of some kind, but we couldn't verify and couldn't get any details. So they evolved out of their life of crime. They largely were able to dodge any official consequences of their irrational choices and bad choices to become a drug dealer, and that is our 6 years of research and our book wrapped up in about 20 minutes, and I look forward to discussing it more with y'all. And that apparently brings us to the ethical part of our discussion.
Well, you could argue it's all ethical, isn't it? So the question is, what is the ethical issue in this? Is Erik himself, by engaging in that type of research, knowing what these people were doing, but not reporting it to any law enforcement authority, does that make him a criminal? Are there points at which harm was being produced as a result of actions that hadn't been stopped, that could have been stopped, had other people known about it? So those are the kinds of questions that face researchers who are engaged in this kind of interactive, ethnographic subject. Yeah?
I just have a general question.
Please.
When you were doing your research, did you have any personal information on the subjects other than these nicknames?
Yes, I
In
did.
other words, you knew names, addresses, email addresses,
I did.
and then these people were confessing crimes to you.
They were.
And were you ever contacted by law enforcement after your book was published, asking you to turn in these subjects?
We were not, and maybe one of the reasons for that, there are entities that regulate research on academic institutions nationwide and probably internationally called institutional review boards. And my advisors in graduate school said that this was the longest institutional review board approval process they had ever seen, and I understand why that was so. To go through that process and to get approval, I applied for what's called a certificate of confidentiality, from the Department of Health and Human Services and the National Institute of Health, and eventually earned it. And it provided me, the researcher, and the research team some degree of protection against forced disclosure of information to law enforcement. And it's my understanding this is an underutilized tool in the social sciences, but we detailed the certificate of confidentiality in the book in some detail. And during the portion of the research where I was pretty sure the police were coming at any moment due to their bungling, I made sure to have a copy with me. I read the statutes that guide the certificates. It had gone before the New York Court of Appeals once in 1973 and was upheld. I wasn't entirely clear what would happen if the rubber met the road, as they say, but that would have granted me some degree of protection. And I'm glad I never had to find out how much.
But there are.
Subjects are glad too.
I'm sure they are.
But there are researchers who are serving jail time for not revealing the information that they have when asked, who haven't got that kind of protection. Yes.
So that begs the question, how many of your subjects did you actually show that document to or explain to that they had confidentiality?
I made general statements about confidentiality, and in the book we painted things quite ambiguously, locating the study somewhere in Los Angeles, Orange, Riverside, or San Diego County, for example. I had my whole spiel prepared, and when I took graduate level research methods courses, you hyper-litigate the language that you put in your confidentiality statement. So I was prepared, but ended up giving it to reading it aloud to very few subjects because frankly they had no interest. And I was somewhat shocked, and it was indicative of their character, but I was somewhat shocked that they really weren't concerned about how it was going to protect their identity. They really weren't concerned about what type of information I was asking about, and really weren't concerned in general. So I read it to very few subjects, so very few would have been aware.
Richard? Did you end?
Yes. What would you suggest doing with, not to mention the name of the institution, but a, should we say, ethically and completely morally bankrupt university in our town that subverts the judiciary through a lot of drug applying before they put forth their agenda at the Red Mass, typically beer, wine, and some high-end scotch.
Okay.
And they have stolen large amounts of money under the false pretense of aiding the poor through a legal aid program, and have never, in all of our subjects, ever kept any appointment despite bilking these people, the victims, out of their own resources to repeatedly get there. What would you do with that university?
In the interest of full disclosure, we're clearly talking about a local private institution that potentially employs me.
I'm not thinking names of the institution that goes to the Red Mass.
I have to be honest, as a graduate student, I was in Orange County at UC Irvine, and now as an assistant professor, I have the good fortune of working for the University of San Diego here in town. And I'm frankly just not familiar with those intimate details. I look forward to having the conversation, but I think I've got to pass on answering the question.
Okay, yeah, so you're up first.
In the context of all of these considerations, I don't know if there's any formal definition of the victim as a crime. It is a formal distinction, but clearly the common sense distinction is the victim is a crime, therefore it's a whole other can of worms than a victim crime. But is that actually a distinction that exists in the literature?
Yes. There's a distinction that's made, but it becomes very difficult to substantiate because it's all around the issue of is harm produced. And if there's no harm produced, and you can document that the crime is a crime only against others' moral positions, that is arguably a victimless crime. But where there's harm being done, that becomes a very variable line. When there's harm being done,
but it's self-chosen harm. I mean, and there's two considerations here. There's the self-chosen harm of drugs, right? And then there's the second one, that the supply is such that taking out 10, 20, 30 suppliers makes no difference on that campus. So you got to stick to some common sense here. It ain't going to make no difference what you do. But on the other hand, I don't know if that common sense is allowed into these kinds of rarefied ethical discussions on your committee's mark.
Part of the issue is how do you know when someone who volunteers to engage in an activity is fully protecting or aware of their own, the harms they're producing to themselves, and how are they, how far are they consenting to that engagement? Are they coerced into it? Are they pressured into it? Do they know the impact of being engaged in drug activity? Those kinds of questions then raise the question as to whether you're actually creating harm, even though they're volunteered to do it.
But in this context of the college students, it's more apt that the people at a party who cajole, coerce someone into drinking way too much booze and having a heart attack, or the various ways that they can die in that circumstance, they're much more suspect along those lines. That no one accuses the beer sellers, and that's really the parallel to this. And so I wouldn't look to them as far as coercing. They don't coerce the person to do it.
I can say from my personal experience that, and I've often used this research as a platform to discuss John Stuart Mill and crimes with no averse victims. I can say personally that it made a big difference to me that this wasn't a predatory crime. That everyone who was engaged in the action, which caused some degree of harm, was a willing, if not enthusiastic, participant, and often went to great lengths to seek out these types of opportunities. So that made a big difference to me. I think if a friend of mine had evolved into a predatory life of crime, they would have raised a whole host of ethical issues, and I would have treated it dramatically differently. I also think if it was an underground market for guns as opposed to marijuana, I would have approached it much, much, much differently. So it was really a narrow set of circumstances under which I was comfortable.
This guy next to
Yeah, it seemed to me that you argued that these people were irrational and not making good decisions, but if they know their parents will produce $100,000 in pets, they're making perfectly reasonable decisions, whereas the ghetto kid doesn't have no dog about the Fourth Amendment because he doesn't have a parent who's going to produce $100,000 in pets. So I don't, structurally, the argument's wrong. These kids know perfectly reasonable behavior.
And your argument, I actually agree with you. And that's why I framed that statement as when I entered the research, I was struck by the fact that it seemed like these folks had so little to gain and so much to lose. And it wasn't until I had evidence that confirmed what criminologists have known for decades, which is about the vulnerability of urban open-air drug markets as something Peter Moskos calls an arrest free-for-all, that the quote-unquote silent majority of the drug trade are somehow off the radar. So entering the research, I had those questions. Midway through, I didn't have those same questions for just the reasons that you argued.
Right, although to some extent, many people involved in drug exchange activities, and particularly college students who are engaged in that, do so not because of the money that they're going to get out of it, but because of the social rewards and the thrill of beating the system, of being a person in the network, as someone who can provide favors to others, and so on. So those kinds of activities question the pure economic rationality of their decision making. It's a reward-based thing, but it's got a lot more social content than that. Yes?
I have a bunch of small questions, but some will change. There was one thing that just struck me now, and that is there are other crimes going on. For instance, these people also look like tax evasion. You got $40,000 a month.
Right. Presumably tax evasion, yes. But with that exception, it might be too strong to say these were the only crimes they were engaged in. They were probably the only crimes that I knew of that they were engaged in. We did have subjects who were the victims of other crimes. We had 3 subjects who told us their story, which admittedly we couldn't verify, but who told us a story about a home invasion robbery in which, as kind of the cliche narrative would go, their house was broken into, they were tied up and held at gunpoint and robbed of electronics, money, and illegal drugs. And as any good drug dealer would do upon being robbed and after the robbers left, and we have their first-hand account, again, an unverified first-hand account in the book, they freed themselves and then immediately called the police and said that they had been robbed, and to make a long story short, the perpetrators were caught within the day. And the drug dealer victims got their electronics returned, and again, unverified account, they claim to have gotten their electronics returned and the money returned, but claim to have nothing to do with the drugs found on the perpetrators.
Yeah.
Kind of the discussion focuses on personal ethics compliment Eric's a friend. I read the book. What I found most interesting and what I'd love to hear a comment on is actually, you know, talking about the prescription drugs and then talking about the more illicit drugs. In talking about the illicit drugs, there is commentary on the war on drugs and the failures of it, or contextualizing it with your research. There's kind of a national ethical issue that gets raised there with respect to race and class and the war on drugs. But what I found also interesting was talking about the prescription drug dealers that you kind of fell into, and the biotech, biomedical industry, and basically these big drug companies and lobbying in Washington's view of regulating pills, and the advertising and marketing dollars being spent to convince us all that we need these pills and having them readily available in pharmacies and in Mexico and whatnot. It's a different ethical question, kind of looking at national policies and how they interface with your research. I was just wondering if you could comment on the extent to which, as a sociologist, you feel it's your role to take your individual subject and scope of your research and then make the commentary. Or do you feel like it's really a role to just put it out there and be a little bit more neutral on what's going on the national scale?
I appreciate the question, and I don't look at those as a dichotomy. I think we can interpret evidence and put forth our interpretation, but I feel that my role as a scientist is to present carefully gathered evidence and to produce and disseminate knowledge with pragmatic corresponding policy recommendations. I don't feel it's, and reasonable people disagree here, I don't feel my job as a teacher and a scientist is to explicitly advocate something for something unless it is absolutely driven by the data. So I try to have a real policy orientation. Onto the dichotomy between prescription drugs and traditional illicit drugs. We had subjects who felt that their criminal use of prescription drugs was somehow less criminal because of how they originate. So we had several subjects who used OxyContin or hillbilly heroin because of where it originated, who used it regularly and who framed their use much differently than they would have framed their use about heroin, we think. So as a drug policy analyst, the new era of drug policy is going to be shaped by prescription drugs. When you look at the University of Michigan Monitoring the Future study, we have, and I won't get these numbers exactly right, 14.7 million current marijuana users, roughly 9 million current criminal users of prescription drugs, and then the next modal category is cocaine at around 2 million current users. So the current modal use of illicit drugs is marijuana, prescription drugs, and then everything else. So this is going to be a critical discussion, and if our small sample of 50, which again in the business we'd say we have an external validity problem because we have such a small sample, it's hard to extrapolate. Maybe these are very unique dynamics happening one location at one moment in time. But if we have people using dangerous prescription drugs illegally, in part because they feel it's okay because they came from a pharmaceutical company, we need to have a discussion about that. We need to craft our policies to address that, and with some tragic consequences as we detail in the book. All right.
Sort of following up on this discussion, what you were just describing raised a question for me. And from what I know of the prescription drug misuse that happens, it's largely a white affluent community problem of white affluent, particularly young white affluent folks. So I wonder how you might speculate. One of the main findings of your book is that these affluent white college kids get away with dealing drugs because they don't fit the model of the drug dealer that everyone's looking out for. So I wonder, as prescription drug misuse becomes a more and more prevalent issue, if folks like that might start to be targeted or come under closer scrutiny, or if you think that these dynamics are so much bigger that they'll continue to be able to operate when they really are.
Now, admittedly, sociologists and criminologists have a poor record trying to predict the future. But I do, my sense from my small sample is that I expect these dynamics are fairly ubiquitous and would apply to an emerging illegal market for prescription drugs. For example, as we were finishing the book, the San Diego State University was the lead story on CNN for a full day as it was unveiled that the DEA and local police had engaged in a one-year undercover operation called Operation Sudden Fall, in which they arrested, was it 136? 175.
No, 75.
Oh, 75. Thank you very much. 75 alleged drug dealers on the campus of San Diego State. And in the wake of those arrests, and in, I believe, the final page of the book, there's the public relations officer from the DEA who's quoted in the San Diego Union Tribune saying, and I won't get the quote exactly right, but uncovering a drug dealing network, we've always known there's drug use in college, but uncovering a drug dealing network that's actually built on a college campus is something that you just don't see. And when we appeared on the These Days program, we had 2 of the 4 callers call in and say that they had these similar experiences decades in the past, and I'm not naive enough to believe this is the only undetected drug dealing network on a college campus. So I think, to answer your question more directly, it's a larger umbrella issue about relative immunity that I suspect would apply to both prescription drugs and traditional illicit drugs.
Hi, Eric. I'm getting an MBA, so as I'm listening to your description of how drug dealers are branded, they're not branded as the I'm a white person. Now, why would the media, and what are the ethical implications of the media not deviating from that brand of this is a drug dealer?
I do think the media has a critical role to play, but it's a little tangential to my main training to comment on that. But so tangential, to try to answer your question as best I can as a criminologist, law enforcement has a real role to play here as well. Again, we have 2.3 million people incarcerated, more than any Western democracy in the history of the world. 25% of which, or 575,000, are there for drug crime, where their primary crime was a drug crime. At the turn of the new millennium, we have more people locked up in this country for drug crime than the entire European Union has locked up for all crime. And that's an absolutely staggering piece of empirical evidence. When you look at the demographics of those people incarcerated as drug offenders, we see a dramatic overrepresentation of the poor, of people of color, and especially poor people of color. So one of the critical research questions we have as criminologists is, why does our prison population look so different than our general population? Well, a lot of real experts speculate that first and foremost the war on drugs accounts for that difference. So then that raises the question, well, do poor people of color commit more drug crime? And if you look at decades of evidence, it seems 77% of drug users are white. Drug crime, tragically, seems to be relatively ubiquitous across groups over time and space. So while the media definitely has a role to play, I would argue so does law enforcement about rethinking possibly a more rational approach to drug crime. And if we are going to have punitive prohibition and a really harsh approach to drug crime, at the very least it should be equally distributed. So absolutely the war on drugs disproportionately impacts certain communities, and that could then facilitate public perception.
You mentioned that the nature of the crime was important for you personally, thinking about the ethical implications. I wonder if coming into it, did you have some sense of what kinds of crime might be a deal breaker for you in this? Or did you ever come up against moments where you had to ask yourself, am I approaching something that might be a deal breaker for me in this?
I was relatively familiar with my friend Bryce and kind of his day-to-day lifestyle prior to ever thinking about this as a research site. So frankly, I got to make a relatively informed decision about entering the scene, and was familiar enough where I anticipated not being confronted by some of those surprises. So entering the scene, to answer the first part of your question, I was fairly confident about, while I dramatically underrepresented or didn't anticipate the scope of the crimes that were happening, the nature of the business was something I kind of found what I expected to find. Bryce described the network as quote-unquote friendly-like. There was a complete lack of what Peter Reuter calls competitive violence, because apparently there's a tremendous demand for all illegal drugs, so there's no competition between drug dealers and they're going to fight over drug turf. Actually, some of our dealers were found pawning off their customers to people, to new drug dealers they didn't even know because they simply just couldn't handle the quantity of people. So there was, and some of these people were just a name and a phone number. And they'd say, well, we have, you know, an overflow of drug customers. Can we please send some your way? So that's counterintuitive and contradicts much of what's in the criminological literature about drug networks. So entering the scene, I was fairly comfortable, and I can honestly say there was no moment where I anticipated other crimes happening that would make me ethically uncomfortable, and was fortunate enough, again, in the 6 years where I didn't have to confront that.
You know, just let me interrupt. So there was this SDSU case that was referred to earlier. By the way, the majority of majors in their business also, I know because I counted them, because they didn't get highlighted. Who got highlighted were the criminal justice majors. There were one or two of them. But in that situation where you've got a university that's got a large amount of this activity ongoing, and a decision is made by law enforcement in the Operation Southern Fall case, which is the name this was given, to continue to investigate without arresting those involved, and they were doing this over a year or longer period. Is there an ethical challenge to law enforcement that had they intervened earlier, not only would the deterrent effect be greater, but they would have minimized the impact on the 75 students who were subsequently arrested, because lots of them would not have their careers, lives ruined by the arrest and the record. And so there's another ethical question there, not just on ethical researchers, but on the ethics of law enforcement officers. Yeah.
Erik, you talk about inserting yourself into the situation, just a variation on Heisenberg principle. Is your being in there, do you think, affect the way they behave so that the information you got is not pristine?
Very good question. I think the lack of concern in general exhibited by our subjects for law enforcement, let alone a lowly social science researcher, the sense I got was that there was minimal impact on the subjects themselves. I got the gut feeling that most of what they were telling us was honest. We were able to verify and triangulate most of our data to make sure we were doing our good, thorough job as a social scientist. And coming and going from interviews, often drug dealers were conducting their illegal business. And so it seemed fairly natural, because they weren't only dealing with me, they were dealing with other people. Or they were dealing with other people, then interviewing with me. I just want to make sure I'm careful with my language right now. And so it felt fairly organic.
Coming from a human factors perspective, as a result of your research, and it seems as though you kind of got a rapport with these folks. Now that you're away from the study, if you were to see illicit drug, the guy comes with the drug in the car now as you're walking by, do you feel now that you would look at that drug exchange more as no different than a parking violation, or has it changed your perspective of, hey, this is actually an illegal act and maybe I should mention something?
I can say the perspective of mine that changed, to be totally frank, was as a criminologist reading similar ethnographies. One great one done by Philippe Boudoir called Selling Crack in El Barrio, and this Terry Williams' Cocaine Kids, Patricia Adler's Wheeling and Dealing. One thing that was maybe changed my perception, all of these ethnographies are ripe with violence. And while I didn't anticipate seeing any violence and ended up never seeing any violence over the 6 years, my perception did change in that maybe it is possible for a drug dealing network to exist non-violently and somewhat indefinitely. So the question, did it change my perception of drug crime generally? Frankly, I don't know. That's something I'd like to give some more thought to. Probably seeing a criminal activity thousands of times, probably like seeing anything thousands of times, softens your perception of that issue a little bit. And as a social scientist, there's one of my favorite researchers, E. Darian Smith, writes that ethnographic research is inherently sympathetic and that we should just give up this notion of objectivity. and that what you should try to do is actively minimize as best you can whatever predetermined biases and sympathy for your subjects who, in this case, are clearly taking some degree of risk to help me further my career, and that was something I was aware of. So it probably softened my view on drug use and drug crime, but only a little bit. That's going to be my answer.
Yes.
A couple of comments. I mean, you used the word shocking, and then you later explained that you weren't shocked later to find out that this demographic group was cavalier about being caught. And I want to suggest that, of course, if their aspirations were to go into business or maybe into politics, there's no ramifications, there's no disqualifications later in licensing or being a mayor that says, well, if you have a conviction of any kind of felony, that you cannot then run for a political purpose, you know. I mean, there's more licensing criteria for your background for being a veterinarian or being a teacher than there is. Another comment that maybe you could clarify is now as a teacher, you know you're a mandated reporter for certain kinds of crimes, particularly crimes of intention to murder or to molest, or, you know, or if there's a minor involved. On your confidentiality that you went and took an extra step in doing, you know, was it delineated about what kinds of things you were mandated to report? And then the last comment I wanted to make, that was a question between my comments, is maybe coming from the South, I know that all kinds of crime, not just drugs, are disproportionately enforced against people of poor color, you know. And so to me that is not shocking in our idea that this, I think it's important, obviously, your work, because it did document what perhaps some of us have known for decades. But whether it's shocking or surprising even, I don't know if I would use those words, because this has been documented for, like I said, my whole lifetime, that the people who are incarcerated are not the rich wasps. Do you see your research making any difference in that?
Let me answer the last question first, and I appreciate the question very much. It has been, as you suggested, it's been documented for decades that visibility, population density, police habits all kind of converge. The unfortunate distinction of getting the public defender over a private attorney. We know all these things come together and result in an over-incarceration of the poor and people of color. But where I would challenge you, I don't know that that's an assumption that's held nationally, and I have no data to support if it is or if it's not. So I had read, you know, for the better part of my adult life, the criminological literature about these issues, about the over-policing of the poor and people of color and similar crimes being treated differently by the criminal justice system. The relatively unique lens that this project brings is the flip side of that argument, which is a lot of the criminal literature is about the targets, and the relatively small sample study we did here is about the anti-targets. So while it reaffirms a finding that's been in place for decades, it reaffirms it in a different way from the perspective of the subjects themselves. We have Anne saying one of the reasons she didn't think she got caught is that they pay everything on time, we don't have parties, we don't live in the ghetto. So it even seemed to be an issue that the subjects themselves were aware of. So yes, it confirms an existing finding. I would like to think the best spin is that it confirms it in a new and somewhat interesting way, hearing from the drug dealers themselves, but it's not a new finding. Do I think it's going to make any difference? And color me pessimistic. But one of the ways we're failing as criminologists and probably as academics more broadly is that we largely write in these elitist journals that are circulated among the other 15 people in your specialty, and then we fly to Switzerland to talk about it. And I think that's a massive, massive, massive problem and something we need to be accountable for. And not to all pat ourselves on the back, but I think public discussions and public forums are probably what are needed. If our job as science is to inform public and political discourse about crime and crime dynamics, I think these types of forums are probably more valuable than the traditional academic arteries, which are by definition, I think, fairly limited. So as a discipline and as a criminologist, I'm fairly pessimistic about having any long-term policy impact, but I'm trying to fight the good fight.
This lady hasn't spoken.
Well, I would like to invite you to take to consider another avenue that you could use your research, because as I sit here, I frame the people that you dealt with as very privileged people who came from affluent parents who pretty much picked them up every single time that they fell down and never allowed them to have any consequences, so that they didn't develop any kind of moral fiber about consequences, so that they then, you describe these parents as being powerful, you know, many of them powerful, big positions, and so I could see how children of those people would go to college and get a real thrill out of, you know, going against the law and getting away with it. But I wondered that you might frame a program around, or looking at putting your information to affluent parents who says, this is what we're seeing. These are people who are privileged. This is a moral conscience that is or is not, you know, my judgment, not yours, is not being developed. Is there a chance that we can challenge that by the fact that you're parenting, that you're not allowing consequences, they can then go to this, you know, to this level, and law enforcement sort of colludes with them, like you said, of not being branded. You know, I think it would be a hell of a PTA meeting. And sure, I wanted to ask you a question though, since I do see them as being maybe a product of that kind of parenting, as a great possibility. Is there a possibility that you are dealing with really like sociopaths who really have no conscience? And did you, in your research, did you give them any tests? Did you do anything other than just do interviews with them to attempt to determine? Because they did surprisingly then graduate and go away from, which also says something about a dynamic point.
I really appreciate your questions. I'm going to answer them as best I can as a criminologist and also as a parent, because these are really, I'm a 4-year-old, these are really critical education, teachable moments. So let's talk about the interesting PTA moment. One of my favorite recent articles is called Safety First, and it's about a rational and honest discussion about drugs in public education. And we now see policy analyses of the DARE program, the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program, that almost universally show it didn't have a significant impact when you can compare the experimental group to the control group. Some studies even show it was counterproductive, in that the people who had DARE were statistically significantly more likely to use illegal drugs and for longer periods of time and more significant drugs compared to the people that had no such drug education. And frankly, I think that's our teachable moment. And again, this is a small sample of 50, but this article really details that one of the reasons DARE failed is that there was a legitimacy problem, in that drug dealers were largely framed as outsiders from the community. And I remember the cartoon sketchbook from my own DARE curriculum, with the trench coat, the guy with the trench coat and the scruffy beard and the hat and the long hair preying on naive young people and school children. And I speculate that that's probably accurate to some extent. However, this article details that most often people are introduced to drugs, illegal drugs, by friends and family, and that it's not this outsider in the community coming in to prey on young people, but rather a much different dynamic. So if DARE failed because we weren't honestly representing the sellers and users of drugs to young people, maybe that's a glimpse of hope where this research could speak to the fact, and I think about this with my own daughter, that when she's of age, and I'm yet to determine what age that will be, but when she's at an age when we want to start dealing with these issues, I think it's going to be important to tell her the hard truth about it's about making good, healthy decisions for yourself, and you can't expect any particular environment to shield you from anything, and that you have to make good, smart decisions for yourself. So that was the hybrid criminologist and parent answer. Did I give them any tests and were they a sociopath artery? I didn't. I don't feel that I was positioned to conduct that or trained to do that. It did seem to me, again, as a criminologist, not a psychologist in any way, that they were relatively, while flippant and a few were brash and downright not fun to be around, a few of them, I would say the bulk were generally well-adjusted young people making bad decisions. So they maintained relatively, they were relatively successful students. They would go home for the holidays and presumably put on this image to their parents. So at least the people I knew well enough, I never considered them to be sociopathic. There were a few people who were brash and a few people who were condescending that maybe you'd want to explore that with, but for the bulk I could say no.
Can you repeat that question?
Yes. Did any of the subjects feel remorse when they went back 7 years later?
In our follow-up, we had people frame their drug dealing as doing favors for friends. We had some of our female drug dealers say that they felt that they gave their girlfriends in particular a place where they could go, where they didn't have to go to these other places to get illegal drugs. So not only was it not a remorseful I made a mistake, it was framed the opposite.
I was wondering if were all your research subjects from their operations were in San Diego County?
Established qualitative research methods procedures thankfully absolved me from having to answer that question. But let me tell you how we answered it in the book. And there's a legacy of research, in part guided by ethics, about how you have to protect vulnerable subject populations and paint things fairly ambiguously. So I was a graduate student in Orange County. My co-author lived in Los Angeles and worked in San Diego. So we framed this study as taking place somewhere in Southern California, in Los Angeles, Orange, San Diego, or Riverside counties, which employs which has, I believe, 25 million people and over 65 colleges and universities.
The only reason I asked that because I was just wondering if, being that we're so close to the border and obviously large flood of drugs coming into that area, I was just wondering if that somehow might have offset all the research, whereas you might have studied an affluent region in say, Washington or something like that. I was just wondering if you encountered problems with that, perhaps, in your research.
We did have subjects who would go to great lengths to get to Mexico to buy prescription drugs in particular. We had one subject whose moniker was Eileen, who would go and buy large amounts of illegal prescription drugs in the bathrooms of strip clubs in Mexico. And, I don't feel I'm a great author, but all you have to do is print her words on a page, and I think it's a pretty engaging segment. So there were, with the prescription drugs in particular, there was a clear and direct, although not often used, Mexico connection. It seemed, and I don't know where our top dealers got their drugs, but I got the sense they were supplied by relatively independent, large-scale marijuana cultivators across several states. So I don't have any evidence to support anything other than that. But since you brought up Mexico, we do know if we're talking about policy, and a few questions back we're talking about policy, a recent study came out that suggested that somewhere in the neighborhood of 60% of the revenue for the current Mexican drug cartels is from marijuana alone. And I think that should be an important part of this discussion.
Okay, we'll back on.
Sorry. Going back to some of the comments you were making about the difference between what the cops going after drug-type folks and college folks, I think what has to come into consideration is the consequence of the action. Most of the time, your college dealers are dealing with college students who at best is going to fail as best because they are high. I think the resources they have to go after, where in consequences in most of the other drug dealer areas, it ends up in some sort of death or violence or something like that. So the fact that our criminal system is full of the African American population from the ghetto is probably more a result of what could have been the result of that action. Now, oftentimes, a lot of the younger kids that seem like minor drug stuff that are getting in the criminal system are often getting there because they're supplying information on what could have been a much bigger consequence, which I think your drug dealers in the college environment, part of the reason they weren't scared of the cops is because they knew that there was no big consequence of their action in the end. Now, if things were to turn and they had your typical rat population problem where you have few drug deals where you start having turf competition and there starts to be violence or actual shootings on the college campus because of drug activity, then I think you would see a turn.
I appreciate your commentary, and that raises a larger theoretical discussion about what we think the law should and should not do. Your argument presupposes that the role of the criminal justice system is to police crimes based on a predicted notion of harm. And while I might tend to agree with you, my read on our founding documents, the Constitution and others, is that there are certain, it's behavior-based. There are certain behaviors that are prohibited and certain behaviors that are not prohibited, and when you violate the law, theoretically, you should be punished. So there's a larger, what do we think the purpose of the law in the criminal justice system is, theoretical conversation to be had, and we can do Emmanuel Kant versus Jeremy Bentham, and I think it'd make for a great seminar class. One of my favorite authors in policing, Peter Moskos, talks about just this issue. He has a PhD in sociology from Harvard and was challenged by many of his mentors. He was writing about policing and they essentially said, you don't know anything about policing. So he became a police officer in East Baltimore, full salary police officer for 2 years, and wrote about his experiences in a book called Cop in the Hood. And it's about police and communities of color and traditionally marginalized groups. And he argues quite strongly in favor of police discretion based on these notions of harm. And some of his employers are sympathetic to that, and some of the police brass are not sympathetic to that approach. And I think, so that tension you outlined, I think is one that we need to explore.
Well, part of the justification of the ethics on this question, where this would give you unique policy implications, so including the other studies that were similar, would also the implications of
For me personally, the policy implications do confirm much of which has been well documented in the criminological literature, which is about, first and foremost, small sample, one place, one time, but it confirms a bountiful legacy of existing evidence that illegal drugs are widely available, relatively more pure than they have been in the past, relatively less expensive than they have been in the past, and again, equally as available as they have been during any moment in the war on drugs. So if there is a direct policy outcome of a small sample study, I think that, you know, when Nixon declared a war on drugs in 1972, we haven't seen a decrease in drug availability, relative cost, or purity. And we spend more money fighting the war on drugs every year than we did on the entire first Persian Gulf War. And if we're looking at our outcomes about drug use and drug availability, clearly there's a problem.
Yeah, but that doesn't come from the nature of the study that you did.
Correct.
Opposed to just the other studies. So from the ethics, questionable ethics, were justified by the policy insights that you couldn't get any other way.
I do think this study reaffirms those findings. While they're not new, I do think it contributes to this legacy and reaffirms those findings. So are there unique policy implications that stem from this study alone?
Or this type of study. You quoted 5 or 6 other books.
I did. They're all... our subject population is dramatically different than the other studies. Most were violent, and they were people in different social locations, that's for sure. So I don't know if it's a cohesive enough body of literature to have policy implications that stem from them as a group, but I can talk about what I think the policy implications of the, okay. So from the dorm room dealers piece specifically, and this is a troubling policy implication in my estimation, is that it, like Stuart was saying, it shows that people engage in crime for other reasons than just for money. So we have one chapter in the book dedicated to why. Why do rich kids sell drugs when they don't need the money? How desperate of a drug dealer can you be when your parents pay the rent? And there were all these intangible rewards about status and ego gratification, and some people felt like they were providing a service. So if there are policy implications, I think it's a more broad argument about informal social control. And on my read in criminological science in the new millennium, it's about informal social control, that unfortunately formal social control, law enforcement, and the criminal justice system seems to have limited effects. But what we can do is teach norms and values that are favorable to whatever end goals we want to teach. And I think since they had non-money-making motivations largely, it reaffirms the policies about informal social control, norms and values, what we can do in communities, as opposed to what we can do with law enforcement.
You know, it also illustrates the point from the sample that was taken is these people, when you go back and look where they are in many years on, have all matured out of crime. And without well, right.
Well argued.
Well, it does. And part of the issue becomes how many people who are not criminalized, who are locked into that pattern of behavior, are would have otherwise engaged productively in the community, or whatever range of activities that includes, as others do. How many would have done that had they been intervened? In other words, are there ways in which the public policy option involves tweaking early in the system to redirect people into more productive and less harm-producing activities, rather than punitive interventions, which puts them into lives of crime and careers of crime that they can't escape from subsequently. That's what certainly happens to the other class that you publicly police. It often doesn't happen to this class. And you were next.
Yeah, I have a burning question in light of a large criminal conference that occurs here every year. And it is by criminals who are interested in subverting the Constitution and the rules of engagement of alleged pretrial detainees or of alleged suspects. And it's held at the Convention Center and sponsored by a district attorney and city attorney called International Association of Chiefs of Police. And the FBI and the other people who teach how to subvert the law and how to subvert rights have a system where they won't allow any contact whatsoever for bail or any phone call in the 37 hours you're in custody. And they herd the people through, in my case, 34 different cells and no phone calls unless you felate the certain N-word, which I won't repeat, cell block 6 penis. So they won't give you a code to a phone. They won't let you buy a phone card. They won't let you collect call to a cell phone. They won't let you have any contact. How the hell did your people not serve jail time when this is standard of everybody who's rounded up in San Diego?
So if I understand the argument correctly, it's
nobody is allowed any contact whatsoever for bail, at least within the first 37 hours, and that's been documented, and it's been over and over. We've had that fact here. So how the hell did they not suspend time other than one exception? Someone called for them at the point of arrest, and they go down to the detention center. They will not allow a visitor, a contact, or anything. They won't allow either way communication in any way.
If we're talking about relative due process rights, which is, as I understand it, the argument you're making, right, that some people are denied our fundamental due process rights and other people are not.
All the people who go to this detention center are not allowed any of the most basic contact with family, lawyer, medical, bail, anything, now, today. So how did your people in the sample not get sprung before they were booked or not get any time?
The one person who spent the afternoon, Bryce, who spent the afternoon in jail, didn't spend the evening in jail. And I don't know why he did or did not, or why he did not spend the rest of that day in jail. But I think your commentary raises larger questions about relative due process and about the role of social capital in the criminal justice system that I do think is really important. And while there's a legacy of studies on those issues, I think the way my research contributes to your question is that it does show the flip side of those issues, about how social capital does protect you.
You're familiar with what ransom and critique of our bail bond system?
I'm familiar with other critiques of our bail system, but not that one in particular.
Okay, this gentleman over here, the one behind this guy. Oh, he hasn't spoken yet.
Why do you think there's such a big appetite for drug use in this country?
Ooh, I think some of the most convincing criminological literature on that topic is about the consumption of commodities for pleasure. In that we see 77%, internationally, 77% of all drug use is in Western Europe and America. And some criminologists speculate that it's because the social norms of materialism and advertising dollars about the consumption of commodities for pleasure, and thus the consumption of illicit commodities for pleasure isn't opposed to those norms and values, but rather fits nice and neatly within those norms and values.
Indeed, we sell products by selling them as a drug experience. You may remember the Nestle ad for Nestle's chocolate, sweet dreams we cannot resist. That's chocolate? No, that's a drug experience. Did you have a question?
Two thoughts really. One, isn't the whole issue with problems around drugs that we rely on law enforcement to, we call them law enforcement, they are tasked to enforce the law, but we often look to them to help us avoid or deal with criminal issues. It's not what they do. They go out and look for people who are doing the behavior of committing a crime. And somehow we look, I think we talk about law enforcement as if they're going to help society deal with the issues that cause the crime to happen. Does that make sense? No.
Yes, but what? Yes.
Is there a way that makes sense?
Yes, we're actually saying they're producing, that they're responding to the effects and the outcomes, but they're not in the business or charged with being in the business of dealing with the causes.
Right. And you might even say the reason why one reason why there's a big disparity based on people of color and wealth is that where are they going to be able to be most successful at their job with people that don't have the resources that kids in college have to actually avoid being successfully prosecuted. So where are they going to put their energies? Not on college campuses, right? They're going to go where they can actually get the most tick marks. Hey, sorry.
I think
and don't we opt out? I guess so. That's all fine. But don't we essentially opt out of the responsibility of actually addressing why this is all going on by saying, "Oh, the police will take care of it"?
In part. So we have set up a reactive law enforcement strategy to crime, a largely reactive law enforcement strategy to crime. While I don't think my research will contribute to some policy change necessarily, I do think there are some glimmers of hope in the existing criminological literature that I had nothing to do with. One of those is a great book by Erik Fritsvold called Crime and Punishment in America, which details the limited impact of reactive policing and talks